senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I rise to discuss a matter that will likely be before the body next week, a vote on my bipartisan war power resolution to advance the proposition we shouldn't be at war against Iran without a vote of Congress. And I want to take a few minutes today to put this into a context that we may all be discussing a little more next week. I believe very strongly that a war with Iran today is both unnecessary and dangerous. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about why we are at this moment right now where President Trump, as recently as Tuesday night in the State of the Union, is suggesting that we may possibly need to be at war with the nation of Iran. Mr. President, the history of relations between the United States and Iran from the beginning of the 20th century to now is very, very tragic. The U.S. and Iran were generally allies from the turn of the 1900s until the early 1950s. In the middle of World War II, at the Tehran Conference, President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, and leader Stalin basically devised what would be the boundaries of the current-day Iran, and that is essentially stuck. Iran's prehistory was very complicated. And the U.S. earned really significant goodwill from the Iranian people and the Iranian government in being involved in that discussion. We continued being seen as a real ally of Iran. In the early 1950s, after having had essentially a dictatorship or monarchy, Iran elected a popular prime minister. The British government was worried about that government, the Iranian government, efforts to potentially nationalize British oil assets. And so the British government tried to talk the United States into a military action to topple the government of Iran. The U.S. refused and convinced Britain not to do it. But later in 1953, the U.S. and Britain together arranged, and this is basic facts, no supposition, no opinion here, the U.S. and Britain joined in an effort to foment a coup d'etat that toppled the popularly elected government of Iran and installed Reza Pahlavi as the Shah of Iran over the objections of the Iranian people. We did that. Britain did that. The United States then funded the training of a secret police operation in Iran, the Savak, that between 1953 and 1979 perpetrated gross human rights abuses against the Iranian people. This is a history that's not that well known to Americans, but a history that's very well known to Iranians. That dictatorship and the human rights abuses perpetrated by the Savak and the Pahlavi regime eventually led to an uprising in Iran in 1979. And Ayatollah Khomeini and other opposition leaders toppled the Pahlavi regime and took control of the Iranian government. Most Americans remember that Iranian protesters stormed the United States embassy, took 52 hostages in that embassy and held them for 440 plus days. It was not as a result of the change in regime, but there was an additional fact. After the regime changed, the Shah of Iran sought to come to the United States for refuge and medical treatment. The State Department urged President Carter not to allow it on the grounds they were trying to at least maintain some positive future relationship with the Iranian government. But the U.S. allowed the Shah of Iran to come into the United States for medical treatment and care, and that led Iranian protesters to attack the American embassy. That was a horrible, unlawful act, and the hostages held for 444 days were treated very, very badly. But that then led to a series of back and forth between the United States and Iran. The United States in the 1980s funded Iraq in an 8-year war against Iran that cost hundreds of thousands of Iranian lives. The U.S. supplied military assets to Iraq, to Saddam Hussein, to carry out war against Iran. We transferred military assets, including chemical weapons, to Saddam Hussein that were used against the Iranian population. The Iranian population grew to have a deep distrust and fear and even hatred of the United States because of this toppling of the prime minister through the U.S. funding of a war against Iran. During this Iran-Iraq war, the USS Vincennes, a Navy ship, accidentally shot down an Iranian airliner in the region, killing more than 250 Iranian civilians. It was an accident, but Iran didn't believe it was an accident because they knew that the U.S. was funding Iraq in a war against it, and they viewed that attack on their civilian aircraft as something that they could not countenance. As this was happening, then Iran funded Shia militias and terrorist groups that bombed the Marine barracks in Beirut in the early 1980s as the Iran-Iraq war was going on and the U.S. was funding war against Iran. This back and forth started to escalate. Later, as you all know, the United States invaded Iran's two neighbors, to the west, Iraq, to the east, Afghanistan, put U.S. troops all around Iran in its neighborhood. And Iran interpreted those invasions as of a piece with the toppling of their government and the downing of the commercial aircraft and the funding of the Iraq war. And so by the time we get into the 2000s, the depth of enmity between the United States and Iran was so intense. The Iranian regime chants death to America because of this history. And we were friends just 60 or 70 years ago. We took a fundamental turn in the relationship and opened the path for a potential new chapter in U.S.-Iranian relationships when, during the Obama administration, the United States, European allies, and China and Russia joined together to negotiate with Iran to curb their nuclear program. And I wrote a piece of legislation, the Iran Nuclear Review Act, that led to a vote on the floor of the Senate on a diplomatic treaty with Iran to curb their nuclear program. The diplomatic treaty on the first page, in the first paragraph, in the first sentence, had this declaration: Iran reaffirms that it will never seek to purchase, acquire, or develop a nuclear weapon. And the agreement contained other provisions limiting for many years Iranian centrifuge production, Iranian enhancement of uranium. It compelled significant inspections of the Iranian facilities by the International Atomic Energy Agency. This deal was a solid deal that, for the first time in 60 years, actually had us around the table with a party that had grown to be an enemy, together with other allies, but also adversaries like Russia and China, to control Iran's nuclear program. Many of you know that in President Trump's first term, over the objection and advice of his first Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, and his first Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, who told President Trump, please maintain the JCPOA, please maintain the agreement that curtails Iran's nuclear program, and use U.S. sanctions against other Iranian behavior, bad actions in the region, human rights violations, development of missile programs. The JCPOA allowed the U.S. and other nations to use sanctions to punish Iran for non-nuclear activity. And President Trump's team told him, keep the deal in place and use the sanctions against some of these other bad behaviors. Contrary to the advice of these seasoned foreign policy professionals, seasoned defense professionals, Donald Trump tore up the JCPOA, and the United States walked away from it, even though our allies said that it was working, even though China and Russia said that it was working, and even though the International Atomic Energy Agency said that it was working. The consequences of abandoning that deal were very obvious at the time. If the U.S. walked away from a deal that was working, so would Iran. And so they began again to enhance the enrichment of uranium. They began again to produce centrifuges. They ceased allowing the intrusive inspections that had been a component of the JCPOA. But that wasn't the only effect of President Trump abandoning the deal. The parties around the table, our allies who had worked with us on it, couldn't believe that the U.S. was walking away from diplomacy. It weakened trust with our allies, and maybe more importantly, we had China and Russia, two of our great adversaries today, at the table with us to make sure there was not a nuclear Iran. And by walking away from the deal, we further poisoned relationship with those nations who now pose such challenge to the United States. And Mr. President, there was an additional consequence. We were in the middle of negotiating with North Korea about limits to their nuclear program. As soon as they saw the United States abandon a deal that was working, they stopped negotiating with us over limits to their nuclear program. Why would we do a deal with the United States if the U.S. will back out of it? And there's been no real and meaningful progress about the denuclearization of North Korea since the U.S. decided to pull the plug on the JCPOA. So here's where we are today. We have an armada around Iran. The president has said multiple times, and when he says it, you got to believe it, because he bombed Iran in the summer, that he is potentially on the verge of going to war with Iran. What does it mean to have the armada? Let me use a Virginia example. The USS Ford carrier is now positioned near Iran to be used in the case of an attack. Carrier deployments, and the USS Ford deploys out of Virginia, thousands of sailors. Carrier deployments normally last about 7 months. The carrier was in the Middle East. President Trump ordered the Ford to go to the Caribbean to be a show of force around Venezuela. The Ford steamed to the Caribbean. Now the president has ordered the Ford back to the Middle East. A normal deployment for a carrier is 7 months. This is a deployment that is now going to be 11 months long. Our sailors who thought they were going to be home seeing their families for Christmas, it's now going to be 11 months, and it will be the longest deployment of any carrier since the Vietnam War. And our sailors are just ready to be home. The problems with the Ford are almost ones that I don't want to talk about on the floor. Many of the toilets on the Ford are inoperable. These are the kinds of things that happen during a deployment, and that's why you limit a deployment to certain months. You get the ship back in port, you fix it up. The Ford is in tough shape right now and needs to come back to port so that the sailors can see their families, but also that the quality of life and morale on the Ford are in dramatic decline. And so we are at a precipice with U.S. military troops arrayed around Iran. And I just want to say this: war is unnecessary and war is dangerous, and then I will conclude. War is unnecessary. The president says we may need to go against Iran to stop their nuclear program. We had stopped it through diplomacy. Do we really prefer war to diplomacy? And President Trump, in the bombing of Iran in the summer, you'll remember he said we had obliterated the Iranian nuclear program. Well, if that was true 6 months ago, there is no need for us to invade Iran now to stop their nuclear ambitions. The president has said we may need to go to war against Iran to protect the protesters. There are protesters against dictatorial governments all over the world. Are we going to put our sons and daughters into harm's way against those nations to protect protesters? And I have to say, I don't really accept that the president is that worried about Iranian protesters. Why not? The president is currently deporting people to Iran. Iranians who are in the United States who do not have appropriate immigration status, even Iranian Christians, even Iranian dissidents who would be subject to persecution if they are returned to Iran. President Trump has now sent more than 100 of them back to Iran. If he really cared about the rights of Iranians and how they would be treated by their government, he wouldn't be doing that. And finally, the president has said Iran has ballistic missiles. They do. But the U.S. overmatch to Iran's military is so dramatic that any effort by the Iranians to use missiles, and there's been no evidence that that is their intent against the United States unless we use missiles against them, we would obliterate that capacity in an instant were they to use it. War is unnecessary. Mr. President, war is dangerous. War is dangerous for the United States troops. We have put troops all around Iran, all around its borders, in Lebanon, in Israel, in Syria, in Iraq. We not only have troops, we have consulates, for example, in Erbil in the Kurdish section of northern Iraq. U.S. assets are everywhere. We can do a great job of protecting an awful lot of territory, but it would not be hard for even an overmatched nation like Iran, if they are attacked, to reach out and do harm to the U.S. troops or U.S. consulates or U.S. civilians. And for what? This is dangerous to U.S. troops, and I say this as a father of a United States Marine representing a state that is one of the most military states in the nation. War is dangerous to the region. When the United States has believed it could change regimes before in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, what has it gotten us? What has it gotten us? Has it created a more stable region? Hardly. Hardly. To think that we could go in at the barrel of a gun and invade a nation and guarantee that lives lost or injured and that would be worth it because we would be producing something, would be making a prediction about the Middle East that has not been borne out by events of the last 25 years. War is dangerous to broader diplomacy. We had the nations of the world, both our friends in Europe and China and Russia, around the table, and we broke a diplomatic deal, and it would suggest that we are preferring war to diplomacy. Why would nations want to engage in diplomacy with us if they can't trust the United States to stick to our word? Finally, war is dangerous to the United States economy. An invasion of Iran would immediately lead to dramatic increases in the price of oil. American citizens, Virginians, are already laboring under costs that are too high for energy, for health, for groceries, for building supplies. The last thing we need is an unnecessary war that will drive energy prices even higher. War also risks inciting other dictators. If the United States can decide, well, we're going to invade a sovereign nation because we want to do it, what is our ability to stand and justly criticize Vladimir Putin and Russia for invading Ukraine? What argument could we have to China to suggest that they shouldn't incur upon and invade Taiwan? The U.S. should uphold a moral standard so that we can look others in the eye and say, you should uphold the moral standard. We would badly degrade our ability to prevent dictators from invading other sovereign nations if we were to get into a war with Iran. Look, Iran's not a good guy. Iran is a bad guy. Iran punishes protesters. Iran is engaged in all kinds of activity in the region, funding terrorist groups in Syria, in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen. They're doing that. They're doing that at the expense of their own people. Iran engages in activities far away from the Middle East. They have had to remove their ambassadors from nations as far-flung as Morocco and Australia because of activities that are designed in those countries to destabilize them. Iran funded a bombing of a Jewish cultural center in Argentina a couple of decades ago, and they still haven't been held to account of it. So they're not a good guy, they're a bad guy. But are they worth wasting U.S. lives, U.S. money, U.S. credibility over? Let's use other tools like sanctions and not use our own kids' lives to deal with this threat. I'll conclude and just say this. My time as governor from 2006 to 2010 coincided with the mass deployment of Virginians into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And as the governor of Virginia, I had an authority over members of the Virginia National Guard. And the Virginia National Guard deployed in the thousands to Iraq and Afghanistan. And I went to the deployments, and I went to the homecomings, and I went to the wakes, and I went to the funerals. Some of these are too emotional for me to describe on the floor. But in an odd way, one of the most emotional was a day that I went to the Virginia War Memorial to watch a homecoming. U.S. troops coming out of Afghanistan had landed at a base in New Jersey, and they had hopped on a bus to come back to Virginia to reunite with their families. They exited the bus. They got in formation, and their commander announced that this National Guard unit was now returned, all present and accounted for. I knew that commander. He had been a Richmond police officer, and he was deployed with his unit. And I saw in his face that for that entire 6-month deployment, he labored under the incredible strain of wanting to be able to say those words at the end of the deployment, all present and accounted for. And I saw him say those words, and I saw the care and the tension and the fear melt away. And it made me think of the other homecomings I had been to where the commander couldn't say those words. And it made me think about them and what they had labored under. I made a vow when I came to this body that I would do everything in my power to fight tooth and nail against sending our sons and daughters into unnecessary wars. I'm on the Armed Services Committee. I voted for war authorizations. If we need to go to war to defend this country, then those who've signed up to do that, knowing that that might be a possibility, they're ready to serve us, to defend the nation. But an optional war at the whim of a president, ordering troops here and there around the globe as if they're a palace guard for no articulated rationale, puts our kids at risk in a completely unacceptable way. We will have a vote next week on something that I believe is just bedrock constitutional law. We shouldn't be at war without a vote of Congress. We shouldn't be at war with Iran unless members of this body have the guts to have a debate and vote and put their thumbprint on it and say, this is in the national interest. No shortcuts, no end runs around Congress, no end runs around debate in front of the American people and laying out the stakes for them. I can't believe that Virginia, one of the most military states in the country, is so different than other parts of this nation. I can't believe that this nation is like itching for another war in the Middle East. Haven't we learned something from a quarter of century of war in the Middle East? I hope we have. I hope my colleagues will join me next week in suggesting no war unless we vote to authorize it. Mr. President, I yield the floor.